The train whistle cut through the cold morning air, and with it came a woman who would change Silver Creek forever. Eleanor Vance had crossed 2,000 miles to uncover why her husband died on Montana soil. Waiting in that town was Sheriff Caleb Hayes, a cowboy lawman with steady hands, tired eyes, and a secret buried deeper than any grave. Before the snow falls, the land will speak, the guilty will tremble, and two hearts will discover whether truth can bring peace after the storm. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, leave a comment, share it with fellow Western lovers, and subscribe for more heartfelt frontier tales.
The clock on the desk of the Silver Creek Sheriff's office ticked. It was exactly 4:48 in the morning. Caleb Hayes lit the first lamp of the day. He did it every day at this hour. For the past 1,460 days, he had started his morning in this exact way. It was not because he was an early riser by nature. It was not because he loved the quiet hour before dawn. It was because the dark had grown too heavy for him. When he closed his eyes, the shadows would bring back a memory he could not outrun. So he rose. He lit the light. He pushed the night away. The office was neat. Almost too neat for a frontier town. Every pencil had its place. Every paper was stacked straight. There was no clutter, except for the things he did not need. He had kept the room orderly because his mind felt like it was coming apart. Organization gave him something to hold on to when everything else felt lost. On his desk, a long list of tasks sat waiting. He had written them himself. Some were real, but many were not. They were simply jobs he invented to keep his hands busy. An idle mind was a dangerous place. It was a dark place, especially for a man with his past. In the corner of the room, a heavy winter coat hung on a wooden peg. It was not a work coat. It was not the kind of heavy canvas he wore when trekking through the Montana mud or riding out in the cold. It smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Whose coat was it? No one in town knew. He did not talk about it. No one asked. No one. And then there was the small photograph. It lay face down on the right side of his desk. He never threw it away. But he could not look at it either. If he threw it out, it would mean he was moving on. And he knew he did not deserve to move on. Caleb reached up and smoothed his mustache. His grooming was not for vanity. It was a choice. It was one of the few things left in his life that he could still control. He poured black coffee from the pot on the stove. It was cold. It tasted bitter. He drank it anyway. The sharp taste helped him feel something other than the numb emptiness in his chest. He walked to the window. The sky was turning a pale gray. Silver Creek was waking up slow and quiet. It was a small town in the Montana Territory, born from the gold rush of the 1860s. Now it was changing. It was becoming a place of farming and trade. The people of Silver Creek trusted him. They saw Caleb Hayes as a good sheriff. He was the man who kept the peace. But they only saw the surface. They only saw the badge. It is important to understand that those who appear the strongest on the outside often carry the deepest emotional wounds. We should never judge or condemn others based solely on their surface appearance without showing empathy. People see the tall man with the firm handshake. They do not see the hollow space inside his chest. They do not know the burden he carries alone. At 6 in the morning, Caleb stepped outside. The town was still gray, but the air was crisp. The morning breeze carried the smell of pine and coal smoke from the passing trains. He began his daily rounds. His boots made a steady, rhythmic sound on the wooden sidewalk. The first person he saw was Mrs. Calloway. She was sweeping the porch of her boarding house. She was a woman who had seen many men come and go in the territory. "Morning, Sheriff," she said. She stopped her broom. "You eaten yet, Caleb?" "I have," Caleb lied. He had not eaten. His stomach felt tight, the same way it had for 4 long years. Mrs. Calloway looked at him. She knew the truth. But she did not push him. It was an unspoken agreement between them. People in the town knew when to ask and when to stay quiet. "Take care of yourself today," she said, nodding. "I will, Mrs. Calloway," he replied, tipping his hat. A few blocks down, he met Peterson, the man who ran the general store. Peterson was unloading heavy crates of flour from a wagon. "Morning, Caleb," Peterson said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Good morning, Thomas," Caleb said. He shook the man's hand. The grip was firm. "How are the shipments coming from Billings?" "Coming along," Peterson smiled. "My boy writes that he's doing well in school. Says he likes the city life." "Give my best to Martha," Caleb said. He remembered the names. He remembered the little things. He was always there for the town. Across the street, two young boys were running with a wooden hoop. One of them tripped and fell on the hard dirt. He scraped his knee. The boy's face twisted, ready to cry. Caleb walked over quickly. He lifted the boy up. He brushed the dirt from his small pants. "You are all right, son," Caleb said softly. His voice was low and calm. The boy sniffled and nodded. He did not cry. He ran off to join his brother. The boy did not say thank you. But before he ran around the corner, he looked back at the sheriff. It was a look of quiet respect. Caleb returned to his patrol. He did his job well, but everything he did felt like a habit. It was like reading a book he had memorized years ago. The spark of life was gone. Then he saw Marcus Reed sitting on a bench outside the general store. Marcus held an old newspaper from Billings. It was 3 days old. He was not reading. He was waiting. Marcus was a good deputy. He was the son of a free family from Ohio. He had come to Montana in 1870. He worked twice as hard as any man in town just to get half the respect. But he never let the bitterness harden his heart. "Morning," Marcus said without looking up from the paper. "Morning, Marcus," Caleb answered, stopping. "The morning train brought a new arrival," Marcus said, turning the newspaper page. "Mrs. Voss, Eleanor Voss. She came in from Boston." Marcus looked up. "Word is she is here about the land west of the creek." Caleb felt his right hand tighten in his coat pocket. It was his gun hand. It was the hand that had held the revolver on that dark night. He did it without thinking. "What else does she want?" Caleb asked. Marcus looked straight at him. "Why do you ask, Caleb?" "Because people do not travel all the way from Boston just to look at dirt." "You know the name Vance, don't you?" Marcus asked. A long silence followed. The wind rustled the dry leaves in the street. "I know a lot of names," Caleb said. He turned and walked back toward his office. "Let me see the passenger list when you get it." Caleb went inside and shut the door. He locked it, even though he rarely did. He walked to the desk. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the small photograph. The paper was worn at the edges. He picked it up. The man in the picture was younger than Caleb, perhaps by 5 or 6 years. He was standing in front of a small cabin that was being built. One arm was resting on the shoulder of a woman. She was smiling at the camera. She had bright, clear eyes. Next to them, a young boy about 3 years old looked up at a bird flying overhead. The man in the picture was smiling too. Caleb had taken the photograph from the man's vest pocket that night. Not to keep it as a trophy, not to remember the kill, but because he could not leave it in the dirt next to the body. He could not leave it to be trampled by horses. It made no sense to him then. It made no sense to him now. He stared at the picture as if it were a judge reading his sentence. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. He placed the photograph back on the desk. Face down. "I am sorry," he whispered into the quiet air of the room. There was no one to hear him. He was not asking for forgiveness. It was simply a ritual. He said it every morning like a prayer. It was a way to keep going, a way to breathe. The morning train would arrive at 9 o'clock. Caleb looked at the clock on the wall. It was 6:48. There were 2 hours and 12 minutes left. 2 hours to wait. He sat down in his chair, opened his logbook, and began to write. It is vital that we understand a basic truth about human nature. People often appear strong on the outside when they are suffering the most on the inside. We should never judge or condemn others based solely on their surface appearance without showing empathy. Caleb was just such a man. He carried a heavy burden hidden beneath his badge and his quiet, steady demeanor, and now the past was about to arrive on the morning train. The train whistle blew long and hard. It echoed off the hills around Silver Creek. Eleanor Vance stepped down onto the wooden platform. Her boots hit the boards with a dull thud. She took a deep breath of the mountain air. It was thin and cold, carrying the sharp scent of pine and coal smoke. She did not move at first. She simply stood in the crowd. She watched the people. She watched the way people moved when they thought no one was looking. This was a habit from her 20 years as a teacher. A classroom always told a story before a single lesson began. The whispers, the nervous glances, the way people held their coats tight against the morning chill. Silver Creek looked like a town trying very hard to be something it was not. The main street was wide. The buildings were made of fresh timber, but the boardwalk at the corner of the station was already rotting. Money had come to the town, but it had not been spread around to the people. Two men stood near the freight office. They watched her step down from the passenger car. When they saw her looking, they turned and looked at the distant hills. They were waiting, but they were not here to welcome her. Nearby, a little boy tripped and fell on the dirt road. He did not cry, but his small shoulders slumped. A tall man in a dark coat, standing just outside the depot, reached down. He lifted the boy to his feet, brushed the dust from his trousers, and gave a sharp, silent nod before walking away. Eleanor reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the small leather notebook. It was worn from being held. It was worn from being read over and over during the long trip from Boston. She did not open it now. She merely rested her hand against the cover, feeling the firm shape of it against her palm. Eleanor did not carry much. Just a single leather valise. It was not heavy enough for a long stay. It held enough clothes for 2 weeks, maybe 3. That would depend on what she found here. It had been 14 months since Daniel died. In those 14 months, there had been a funeral in a quiet churchyard back east. There had been lawyers and papers. There had been debts that took nearly all her savings to clear. During that time, she had tried to understand how Daniel came to be in Montana. He was an accountant, a quiet, careful man who checked every number twice. He was not a man to ride out into the dark on a stormy night chasing trouble. The officials in the territory had called it an accident. They said it was a mistake made in the dark. But they did not explain why he was 3 miles from town. They did not explain why his pockets were empty of the ledgers he usually carried everywhere. Eleanor did not come here for land. She did not come to find a new husband either. She came to find the truth. Daniel deserved that much from her. As she stood on the platform, a tall figure walked out from the morning shadow. He wore a silver star pinned to his dark wool coat. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the silver in his dark hair. He walked with a heavy, steady step. He moved with a purpose, like a man who never wasted emotion. "Mrs. Vance," he said. His voice was deep, smooth, and low. Eleanor looked up. She did not smile. She was not being rude. She was simply evaluating the man before her. She noted the gray in his temples. She saw the gray in his eyes. "I am Sheriff Hayes," he said. "I know who you are, Sheriff," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, too. "I asked about you before I bought my ticket." The sheriff stopped. He did not look angry. He looked cautious. "You asked?" "People who want the truth do not go into a new town blind," she said. She lifted her valise. "Can you tell me where the land office is, Sheriff?" "It is on the east side of the street," Caleb said. He pointed a large gloved hand toward a green building next to the town hall. "But they do not open until 10 o'clock. "Thank you," Eleanor said. She took a step toward the town. "Mrs. Vance?" he called out to her back. She stopped, but did not turn. "Do you need any help with your security?" he asked. Eleanor turned to face him. She looked straight into his gray eyes. She looked for a long moment, watching the small muscle move in his jaw. "Not yet," she said clearly. "But thank you for asking, Sheriff." She walked toward the boarding house. The street was quiet, save for the wind pushing a dry piece of brush across the wooden path. When Eleanor arrived at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, the front door was unlocked. The house smelled of old wood and peppermint. The room was small. A clean bed sat by the window. There was a small desk, a wash basin, and a wooden chair. Eleanor set her bag on the floor. She sat on the side of the bed. She took the small notebook from her coat pocket. The pages were filled with names and dates. On the first page, she had written in dark ink, Daniel Vance, The Truth of March 14th, 1874. Beneath that line were the figures Daniel had written in his last letter. They did not make sense. They were numbers of land titles that did not match the ledger at the bank. She turned the page to the section labeled People of Interest. There was a name written at the top of the list, Officer C. Hayes. The name had been confirmed by two sources in Billings. Caleb Hayes was the man who had fired the shot that ended Daniel's life. She drew a firm line under the name. She did not add a question mark, not yet. It is vital to understand that a woman's judgment and intuition are valuable tools. Society has often taught people to doubt the thoughts and conclusions of a grieving woman. But Eleanor possessed a sharp mind that saw through superficial details. She knew that people in authority often hide the full picture. She was determined to look past the sheriff's star and find the man behind the badge. Eleanor placed the book on the small wooden table. She adjusted her hair and walked down to the dining room. She needed breakfast, and she needed to learn what the town knew about the land. Meanwhile, Caleb Hayes returned to his office. He sat down at his desk. The room was cold. He did not light a fire. The small stove remained dark. Marcus Reed was sitting on a wooden chair by the window. He was reading a 3-day-old newspaper, but his eyes were on the door. "She is at the boarding house," Marcus said. Caleb took off his coat and hung it on the peg in the corner. He did not look at the coat. "She came to see the land office," Caleb said. His voice sounded dry, like old leaves. "You think she is going to stay?" Marcus asked. "She has the valise, but she did not leave it at the station," Caleb said. He sat down behind his desk. His hands lay flat on the smooth wood. "Caleb, she is going to find out what happened that night," Marcus said. "The town talks. You know that. Someone will tell her the story sooner or later." "Let them," Caleb said. "You know it is not that simple," Marcus said. "You have carried that night for 4 years, like it was a chain on your leg." "It is my chain," Caleb said. He looked out the window toward the boarding house. "And I will carry it." Caleb opened his logbook, picked up a pen, and began to write down his schedule for the day. It was full of meaningless tasks. He had created the work himself. It is important to remember that those who appear the strongest on the outside often carry the deepest emotional wounds. We should never judge or condemn others based solely on their surface appearance without showing empathy. Caleb was a man trapped by his past. He tried to hide his inner pain through hard work and strict rules, but the arrival of Eleanor Vance threatened to break the walls he had built around himself. The morning sun was bright, but it gave no warmth to the high country. Caleb Hayes stood by his desk. The small metal box sat open in the bottom drawer. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice, with the edges yellowed from time. It was an official record from the territorial court. On the top line, written in large dark letters, was the name of the owner of the disputed land west of the creek, Daniel Vance. Caleb read the name aloud. The word tasted like dry ash in his mouth. He read it again. He could not look away. Eleanor Vance was the wife of the man he had killed. His right hand closed into a tight fist. He had spent 4 years training his body not to react to the memory. He did not drink. He did not sleep in a real bed. He stayed in the office night after night to keep the memories at bay. But the guilt was still there. It lived in his bones. The name on the page was not just a name. It was the name of the man whose eyes he had seen in the dark just before the world went black. Caleb closed the box. He locked the drawer. He picked up his hat and walked out into the cold street. The land office was already open. The clerk, a small man with glasses, was sorting through papers on the desk. "Caleb," the clerk said, looking up, "what can I do for you today?" "I need the file for the land west of the creek," Caleb said. "File number 1887-C. The clerk pulled a thick yellow folder from the shelf and handed it over. Caleb opened the folder on the counter. He went through the pages slowly. He looked at the original claim filed 4 years ago. The signature at the bottom of the page was clear. It was Daniel's handwriting, the same hand he had seen on the letters and receipts 4 years ago. But there were pages missing. Pages 14 through 17 were gone. Caleb remembered that night. He remembered taking those very pages out of the case file. He had taken them because they contained personal records about the land and the people involved with Harrison Holt. He had hidden them to protect the town from a panic. He had hidden them out of fear and guilt. "Is there a copy of this?" Caleb asked, pointing to the blank space. "No," the clerk said. "That is the complete file that came from Billings. It has been like that since it was filed." Caleb closed the folder. He thanked the clerk and walked back out into the bright street. It is vital to understand that accountability requires courage. It is very easy to hide the truth when one is in a position of power, but true leadership means facing the consequences of one's actions, regardless of how painful the truth might be. Caleb had hidden the files out of fear, but that choice only prolonged the suffering of others. At 10 in the morning, the door to the sheriff's office opened. Eleanor Vance stepped inside. She did not wait for Caleb to speak. She walked directly to his desk and placed a small, thin notebook on the wood. Caleb stood up. He did not move away. "Sit down, Mrs. Vance," he said. "I prefer to stand," she replied. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white against the leather of her handbag. "What do you need?" Caleb asked. "I went through the records at the land office," she said. Her eyes were fixed on his star. "The file for the land west of the creek is incomplete. Pages are missing, not just 1 or 2. 4 entire pages were removed before it was filed." Caleb did not answer. He knew exactly which pages she meant. "You have been the sheriff here for 6 years, Mr. Hayes," Eleanor continued. Her voice was rhythmic and even. She spoke with the steady cadence of someone used to commanding a room. "Who has access to the records in your office?" "Myself, my 2 deputies, and the clerk," Caleb said. "The clerk is new," Eleanor said. "He's been here for 2 years. The pages were removed 4 years ago." She leaned forward slightly. "That leaves you and your deputy, Mr. Reed." "Mrs. Vance, I am not accusing anyone yet," she said. She held up her hand, stopping him. "I am simply looking at the facts. It is not an accusation to follow a trail of evidence." Caleb looked at her. He saw the fire in her blue eyes. It was not a violent fire. It was the quiet, determined light of a person who knew what they wanted. "Those pages were removed," Caleb said slowly, "but not to hide land ownership." "And then why were they removed?" she asked. Caleb stood there silent. He could not tell her the truth in the middle of the day, in an office where anyone could walk in. Eleanor waited for 3 long seconds. When he did not speak, she nodded. "I will ask you again, Sheriff," she said. "Were you present when my husband was killed?" "Yes," Caleb said. The word was heavy. "Did you fire the shot?" Caleb did not look away. He could not. "I did," he said. Eleanor took a deep breath. Her shoulders rose and fell. She opened her handbag, took out a notebook, and wrote a single line in the margin. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. Her voice was cool and distant. "But honesty does not bring him back, and it does not explain why his work was destroyed." She turned and walked toward the door. "Eleanor," Caleb said. She stopped with her hand on the iron latch of the door. She did not look back. "I want to help you," Caleb said. Eleanor looked over her shoulder. "We are not friends, Sheriff. You are the man who ended my husband's life. Until I know why, you are not helping me." She went outside and shut the door behind her. Caleb sat back down in his chair. The room felt cold. He looked at the logbook on the desk. It is important to remember that human beings have a fundamental right to the truth. We must never conceal facts or manipulate information to serve our own interests. When those in authority fail to be transparent, they undermine the dignity and trust of the community they are sworn to serve. Marcus Reed walked in from the back room. He had been listening the entire time. "She is smart," Marcus said. "Too smart," Caleb said. "She knows about the missing pages," Marcus said. "It will not be long before she finds out about Holt's business with the land." "Holt does not know she is here," Caleb said. "Holt knows everything that happens in this town before noon," Marcus said. He leaned on the desk. "You need to tell her the whole story, Caleb, not just the pieces. If you don't, someone else will." "I cannot tell her," Caleb said. "Not yet." "Why not?" Caleb looked at the small photograph lying face down on the desk. "Because she came for answers," Caleb said. "And the answer is that I was a coward." "You were used, Caleb," Marcus said. "There is a difference." Caleb looked out the window. Down the street, Eleanor was standing outside the boarding house, writing in her notebook. "The result is the same," Caleb said. "The man is dead." Marcus picked up his hat. "I will check the northern trail before the afternoon train arrives." Caleb nodded. He was left alone in the small office. It is vital to understand that a human life is the most precious thing in the world. When a person's life is taken based on a lie or a mistake, the guilt remains with the one who pulled the trigger. Caleb had to learn that admitting his own mistake was the first step toward regaining his humanity and restoring his soul. The morning sun had barely cleared the timberline when Eleanor Vance arrived at the land office. The town of Silver Creek was quiet. A few men were sweeping the boardwalks. A wagon rumbled past, its iron wheels grinding against the dirt. Eleanor stood near the green door of the office. She held her leather notebook under her arm. Her gloves were neat, though worn at the tips. She did not pace. She simply waited. A good teacher knows that patience is not just the act of waiting. It is the steady control of one's own mind. When the clerk turned the iron lock and pulled the door open, Eleanor was already there. She stepped into the small, dusty room. The air smelled of coal dust and old ink. "Good morning, ma'am," the clerk said. He was an older man with wire-rimmed glasses that kept slipping down his nose. "Back again?" "I am," Eleanor said. She laid her notebook on the counter. "I spent the night looking over the copies you gave me, and I found something that does not make sense." The clerk looked down. He reached for a ledger. "What might that be?" "The records regarding the claim filed by my husband, Daniel Vance," Eleanor said. She spoke slowly, making sure every word was clear and sharp. "Pages 14 through 17 are not just blank. They were removed from the binding. The numbers jump from 13 directly to 18. The clerk adjusted his glasses. He looked uncomfortable. He looked away. "I cannot say, ma'am. The files arrive from the territorial office in Billings that way. We just keep the records." "You have been in this office for 2 years," Eleanor said. "But the file was created 4 years ago. Who had access to the records before you came?" "Only the sheriff," the clerk murmured, "and the previous town clerk. But he passed away last winter." Eleanor closed her notebook. She nodded once. She did not show anger. Anger clouds the judgment. It makes a person miss the small, vital details. "Thank you," she said. She turned and left the office. She walked down the boardwalk toward the sheriff's office. She knew what she had to do. She knew that Caleb Hayes was the man who had filed the report. It is important to remember that trust cannot simply be given. It must be earned through small, consistent actions and honesty. When people hide information, they create distrust. But when we look at the facts with an open mind, we learn how to measure the character of those around us. Caleb Hayes was standing by the window of his office when he saw her cross the street. Her back was straight. Her step was deliberate. He could tell by the way she walked that she had found something out. He reached into his pocket and touched his silver star. It was cold. It always felt cold in the morning. The door opened. Eleanor walked in. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," Caleb said. He remained behind his desk. "Sheriff?" Eleanor said. She stopped 3 feet from his desk. She did not take off her gloves. "I spoke with the clerk at the land office." Caleb nodded once. He did not look surprised. "I assumed you would." "The records are incomplete," Eleanor said. "Pages are missing from the original file. The clerk said that you and your deputy were the only ones who had the authority to handle those records." Caleb looked out the window. A horse and rider trotted by in the street outside. The dust rose and settled in the bright morning light. "I took those pages out," Caleb said. His voice was steady. He did not look at her. "Why?" Eleanor asked. Caleb paused. He looked down at his desk. "Because they contained information that the mining company, that Harrison Holt, wanted kept quiet. And because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Eleanor asked. She took a step forward. "Afraid of the truth," Caleb said. He looked into her eyes. "I will show you the land. We can ride out there now. But you need to see the ground for yourself." Eleanor stood still. She studied his face. She looked for a trace of a lie. "Very well. But we go alone." "Marcus is already patrolling the northern road," Caleb said. "We go alone." They rode out of Silver Creek side by side. The horses were quiet, their hooves thudding softly on the dry earth. The valley was wide. The grass was pale, turning brown as the autumn winds began to blow from the high peaks. To the north, the mountains rose sharply, their tops covered in early snow. Caleb did not speak for the first half hour. He kept his eyes on the trail. He watched for any sign of trouble, though the valley seemed empty. Eleanor rode with a straight back. She held the reins lightly, as if she had spent her life on horseback. "This town," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. "It has changed a great deal since Daniel wrote to me." "It has grown," Caleb said. "The railway brought money, but money does not always bring peace." "Did you know him?" Eleanor asked. "My husband." Caleb slowed his horse. He looked at the trail ahead. "I knew him for 2 minutes, Mrs. Vance. Those were the last 2 minutes of his life." Eleanor's hands tightened on the reins. Her voice remained calm. "Tell me what happened." "He was on this land," Caleb said. He pointed to a low hill ahead. "He had a valise with him. He was running. Holt's men had told me that a thief was on the property. They told me he was armed." "And you believed them?" Eleanor asked. "I was a younger man," Caleb said. "I was appointed by the town council to keep the peace. When a man is told that a dangerous man is nearby, and when he sees someone running in the dark, he acts." "Without looking first?" she asked. "Without looking," Caleb said. The words tasted like ash. "I acted in haste, and I made a mistake that I will pay for the rest of my days." Eleanor turned her face to the side. She looked at the hills. "A strong educational principle applies here. We must understand the importance of truth in human relationships. Trust is not built on perfection. It is built on the willingness of a person to admit when they are wrong. When people hide their mistakes, they lose the respect of others. When they speak the truth, even when it is difficult, they begin to rebuild their dignity." They arrived at the creek. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. Eleanor dismounted. She walked down to the edge of the water. She let her hand trail through the cold current. "Daniel wrote about this stream," she said. Her voice was soft. "He said the water was so clear you could see the bottom. He said the sky in Montana was bigger than the sky anywhere else." Caleb tied his horse to a small birch tree. He walked down to the edge of the water. He did not get too close to her. He kept his distance, out of respect for her grief. "He was a good man, Eleanor," Caleb said. He used her first name, though he had not meant to. It slipped out, quiet and heavy. Eleanor did not correct him. She looked up at the hills. He was a man who believed in numbers. He believed that if the figures were right, the world would make sense. The world does not always make sense, Caleb said. I know, she said. She stood up and dusted the dirt from her skirt. Let us look at the land. They walked along the creek toward the cabin site. The ground was rocky. The wind blew through the trees. They were learning about each other, not through words, but through the small things. The way Caleb watched the trail. The way Eleanor looked at the rocks and the soil, not with sadness, but with a sharp mind. Eleanor opened her small notebook. She wrote down a single line. The sheriff regrets his act, but the act remains. It is important to remember that human beings have a duty to respect the truth. We must never conceal facts or manipulate information to serve our own interests. When those in authority fail to be transparent, they undermine the dignity and trust of the community. The sun was dropping behind the ridge when they returned to Silver Creek. The town was preparing for the evening. Smoke rose from the brick chimneys. The lamps were being lit along the main street. Eleanor went straight to the boarding house. She left her notebook on the desk in her room. She needed to speak with Edwin Marsh. The old man lived on the western edge of town. His home was a small, unpainted wooden cabin with a garden full of cabbages. The fence was old, but it was sturdy. Eleanor walked up to the gate and knocked on the wood. An older man opened the door. He wore a patched work shirt and held a pipe in his mouth. His eyes were small and sharp. Mrs. Vance, he said. He did not seem surprised to see her. I thought you might come. You know who I am, Eleanor said. Everyone knows you are here, Edwin said. He opened the gate. Come inside. It is too cold to stand in the yard. Eleanor stepped into the cabin. It was warm. The room was filled with books and old papers. You worked for Mr. Holt for 12 years, Eleanor said. I did the ledgers, Edwin said. He sat down at a small table. He offered her a seat, but she remained standing. I kept the numbers straight, until I realized what those numbers meant. What did they mean? Edwin puffed on his pipe. The blue smoke rose to the wooden beams of the ceiling. Holt doesn't lend money to help people. He lends money so he can take their land. He changes the interest rates after the paper is signed. Eleanor took a pencil from her pocket. Do you have the proof? The real ledger is hidden, Edwin said. But your husband found it. He came to the mine 4 years ago. He was looking for the documents to show the sheriff. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Daniel was going to the sheriff? He was, Edwin said, but Holt found out. He sent word to the sheriff that a thief was at the mine. He told the sheriff to stop him. Eleanor wrote the words down in her notebook. Holt manipulated the sheriff. Where is the real ledger now? She asked. No one knows, Edwin said, but Daniel hid something on that land west of the creek, I am sure of it. Eleanor thanked the old man and left the cabin. The educational value is clear. Economic exploitation and the manipulation of the law are serious offenses against human dignity. A community must remain vigilant to protect its most vulnerable members from such acts. Caleb Hayes sat in his office. He had a small kerosene lamp lit on his desk. He was reading the reports from 4 years ago. He was reading the pages he had not hidden. The statements were brief. Incident of March 14, 1874. Officer C. Hayes reporting. Suspect was armed and running from the mine site. Caleb leaned forward and rested his head in his hands. He had never questioned the report before. He had accepted the story because he needed to believe he was doing his duty. But as he looked at the handwriting, he realized the report was not written by him. It had been written by Holt's clerk and signed by Caleb when his hands were shaking from the shock. He had been used. He was a sheriff wearing a badge paid for by the town, but he had acted as an instrument for a corrupt man. Marcus came into the room. He set a cup of coffee on the desk. She is back from Marsh's place, Marcus said. Caleb looked up. Did she ask about the ledgers? She asked, Marcus said, and I think she knows that Holt lied to you. Caleb stood up. He walked to the window. The night was dark and clear. I need to talk to her, Caleb said. She is at the corner of the main street, Marcus said. Caleb walked out the door and into the cool air. He found her standing under the light of the large lamp outside the general store. She was looking at the distant mountains. Mrs. Vance, Caleb said as he approached. Eleanor turned. She looked at his face. I spoke with Edwin Marsh, Sheriff. He told you about the debt, Caleb said. He told me that Daniel was coming to you with the papers, Eleanor said. She did not raise her voice, but her words were sharp and clear. He told me that Holt used you. Caleb looked down at the wooden boardwalk. He did. Why didn't you look at the body that night, Caleb? Eleanor asked. She used his name again. Why didn't you check his pockets? Caleb looked up. His eyes were dark in the light of the lamp. Because I was a coward. I was afraid of what I would find. I was afraid of the guilt. Eleanor Vance stood very still. The wind blew a strand of her hair across her forehead. She brushed it away. It is important to remember that human rights and human dignity are the foundation of a just society. When an individual is treated unjustly, the entire community suffers. We must teach the value of fairness and honesty, and we must stand against corruption and the abuse of power. I am not here to absolve you of your mistakes, Caleb, Eleanor said. But I am here to find out why he died. Then we find the documents, Caleb said. We find the proof. They looked at each other under the light of the street lamp. There was no pretense between them now. They were two people standing on the same ground. The wind howled from the north. It brought the smell of early snow down from the peaks. Eleanor Vance stood at the front of the schoolhouse. The room was small and smelled of cedar shavings and coal oil. There were 11 children sitting at the wooden benches. They ranged from 6 to 12 years old. Their faces were red from the cold. Eleanor held a piece of white chalk. She wrote a row of numbers on the dark wooden board. Now, she said. Her voice was steady, rhythmic, and clear. If we have 12 apples and we share them among 4 people, how many do we each receive? A small boy, Tommy, raised his hand. He was the blacksmith's son. His hair was messy and his shirt was torn at the elbow. 3, the boy said. Very good, Tommy, Eleanor said. She smiled, a warm, quiet smile that did not rush the room. She turned to write another problem on the board. But as she did, she heard the heavy sound of a horse outside. The children turned their heads toward the small glass window. It's the sheriff, Tommy whispered. Eleanor looked through the window. Caleb Hayes sat on his dark bay horse near the fence. He was holding a piece of paper. He was not looking at the school. He was looking at his own hand. He stayed there for a long time. The wind whipped his dark coat around his legs. It is important to remember that human warmth and compassion arise when we embrace our authentic vulnerabilities rather than perfection. Genuine connection blossoms when people allow themselves to be seen as they are, not as they wish to appear. Caleb was a man who tried to remain isolated. Yet the simple act of watching Eleanor with the children brought a quiet sense of humanity back into his life. Eleanor did not tap the board. She let the children look. She understood that a teacher cannot control where a child's mind wanders. She must guide it. Tommy, she said softly, walking to his bench. What is it about the sheriff's horse that interests you so? It's a big horse, the boy said. It is, Eleanor agreed. And if the sheriff rides 12 miles in 2 hours, how fast is his horse traveling? The boy's eyes lit up. He began to count on his fingers. Caleb remained outside for a few more moments. Then he turned his horse and rode toward the main street. He did not look back. But he had heard the rhythmic, clear sound of her voice through the glass, and it gave him a moment of peace. That evening, the sun set behind the hills in a streak of dull orange. Marcus Reed had invited Caleb and Eleanor to his home at the edge of town. His wife, Clara, had set a large iron pot of stew on the table. The small kitchen was warm. The air smelled of wood smoke and sage. Caleb sat in the corner. He did not say much. He kept his hands in his lap. Eleanor sat across from him. She watched his face in the light of the kerosene lamp. "Pass the bread, Caleb," Marcus said. He spoke with the easy tone of an old friend who knew when to push and when to let the silence be. Caleb reached for the loaf. He cut a thick piece and laid it on Eleanor's plate. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Eat," Clara said, ladling stew into the bowls. "You both look like you have been riding through the Badlands all day." They ate in silence for a few moments. The only sound was the clinking of iron spoons against the tin plates. Marcus looked at his wife, then across the table at the two guests. "Caleb used to be a very different man," Marcus said suddenly. He did not look at Caleb, but out the window into the dark. Before 1874, he would come into this house and laugh until the rafters shook. He could play the fiddle until 2 in the morning. Caleb stopped eating. He kept his eyes on the stew. "People change when they make a mistake," Caleb said. "It wasn't just a mistake, Caleb," Marcus said. "It was a burden you chose to carry alone. A burden that doesn't belong to you anymore." Eleanor looked up. She listened to the men talk. Clara reached over and placed her hand on Marcus's arm. "A community is only as strong as its willingness to share its burdens," Clara said. Her voice was strong and kind. "A man who thinks he must suffer alone does not trust the people around him. We cannot be whole if we keep ourselves locked away." Eleanor nodded. She felt a shift in the air. "Clara is right," Eleanor said. She looked directly at Caleb. "When we hide our mistakes, we build a wall between ourselves and the people we are meant to protect. My husband Daniel knew that truth. He did not hide the ledger. He tried to bring it to the light." Caleb looked at Eleanor. The gray in his eyes was soft in the lamplight. "I know," Caleb said. They finished their meal. There was a sense of warmth in the small cabin that Caleb had not felt in years. It is vital to understand that genuine connection does not come from pretending to be strong or without fault. We are human. We make errors. But when we open ourselves to others and admit our weaknesses, we allow compassion to take root in soil that was once dry and hostile. After the meal, Caleb walked with Eleanor back to the boarding house. The wind had died down. The sky was full of stars. "It is cold tonight," Eleanor said, pulling her wool shawl tight around her shoulders. Caleb took off his dark wool coat and placed it over her shoulders. The coat smelled of cedar and lavender. It was warm from his body. Eleanor did not pull away. She let the coat stay on her. "You do not have to give me this," she said. "I want to," Caleb said. They stopped under the light of the last lamp before the boarding house. "Eleanor, I'm going to find the ledger. I'm going to find out what Holt did." "I will help you," Eleanor said. She looked into his eyes. "But we must be careful. Holt has money and men." "I know," Caleb said. He touched the brim of his hat and turned to go. "Caleb," she called out. He stopped and turned back to face her. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "The stew was good." Caleb gave a small, quiet nod. He turned and walked down the street. It is important to remember that human beings need one another. When we learn to trust, we find that the past does not have to destroy the future. It can be the foundation upon which we build a better, more honest life. The morning was dark and damp. A thick fog lay low over the Silver Creek Valley. Eleanor sat at the small desk in her room at the boarding house. The lamp was turned up high, casting long shadows on the flowered wallpaper. She had been going through the papers she found in the bottom of her trunk. They were letters from Daniel, written during his first year in the territory. They were filled with numbers, names, and descriptions of the people who worked for Holt. But there was one letter that did not look like the others. It was a draft of a letter Daniel had written to the territorial judge in Billings, but he had never sent it. He had kept it in the small leather valise. Eleanor opened the notebook. She began to copy down the names. H. Holt, land speculation. C. Hayes, sheriff, involved by false statement. She read the name of the sheriff again. She thought about the way he had looked at the creek. She thought about the sound of his voice when he spoke about that night. He had admitted his mistake. But was it only a mistake? She needed to see the sheriff's private records. She needed to know what was in the files Caleb had kept in his private office. Eleanor put on her heavy boots and her wool coat. She walked out into the fog. The sheriff's office was empty when Eleanor arrived. The front door was unlatched. Eleanor stepped inside. The room was silent. The stove was cold. She went to the corner of the room where the small wooden desk sat. She pulled out the drawers one by one. They were filled with old receipts and reports. In the bottom drawer, she found a metal box. It was the box she had seen Caleb looking at 2 days before. The lock was simple, a small iron latch that had been worn down by time. She opened the box. Inside was a small, thin notebook with a black cover. The pages were filled with Caleb's handwriting. She opened it and read the first entry. March 14th, 1874. The night is dark, the wind is high. I received the call from Holt at 11 o'clock. He said there was a thief at the mine. I went alone. I saw the man running. I called out. He did not stop. I fired. Eleanor's hands began to shake. She read the next page. I found the body. The man was Daniel Vance. He had no gun. He had only the papers. I looked into his eyes and I knew I was a coward. I hid the file in the floorboards of the mine. I am the man who destroyed this family. Eleanor Vance stood very still. The paper felt heavy in her hand. She had found the proof, but she had read it without the proper context. She did not read the later pages, where Caleb realized that Holt had manipulated the situation. She did not see the notes written a year later, where he realized Holt's men had set the scene. She only saw the admission of the kill. He knew, she whispered to herself. The words were cold. He knew from the beginning. A strong educational principle applies here. We must understand the danger of partial truths. When we look at only a part of the evidence, we risk making the wrong judgment. We need the full picture, the context, and the background to understand why a person made the choices they did. Eleanor closed the notebook. Her face went pale. She felt betrayed, not just by the man who had shot her husband, but by the man who had walked with her in the valley. She put the notebook in her handbag. She turned to leave. Caleb Hayes was coming up the steps of the office. He saw her leaving. He saw the way she held her handbag. Mrs. Vance, Caleb said. He stopped on the wooden boardwalk. The fog clung to his coat. What are you doing here? Eleanor stopped. She looked into his gray eyes. I found the box, Caleb, Eleanor said. Caleb looked at her hands. He saw the black notebook in her handbag. Eleanor, let me explain, Caleb said. There is nothing to explain, Eleanor said. Her voice was cold. It was the voice of a teacher whose student had lied to her. You wrote it yourself. You knew you were the one who killed him. And you knew why. You did not read the whole thing, Caleb said. He took a step toward her. I read enough, Eleanor said. You killed my husband, and you hid the truth for 4 years. She turned and walked away into the fog. Caleb did not follow her. He stood on the boardwalk, watching her disappear into the white mist. He went into his office. He sat down at his desk. The room was dark. He did not light the lamp. It is vital to understand that truth without context can lead to injustice. Eleanor had the evidence of the act, but she did not have the context of the manipulation that led to the act. The story had not yet reached its end, and Caleb was left to face the consequences of his long silence. The wind was quiet. The town of Silver Creek lay still under a high, cloudless sky. It was 9 o'clock at night. The lamps along the main street had burned low. Most of the townspeople were asleep in their beds. Caleb Hayes walked down the center of the road. His boots made a rhythmic, heavy sound against the dirt. The air was cold, but he did not feel the chill. His mind was focused on the boarding house at the far end of the street. He stopped at the wooden gate. He looked at the small window of Eleanor's room. A yellow light was burning behind the glass. She was awake. She was sitting at her small desk, looking at the papers she had taken from his office. He walked up the steps. He did not knock immediately. He took a long, deep breath and let the air out slowly. He raised his hand and struck the wood with his knuckles. 2 raps, short and clear. The lock turned inside. The door opened a few inches. Eleanor stood behind the frame. She wore a high-collared gray dress. Her hair was loose over her shoulders. She looked at him with eyes that were tired and very cold. "I told you, Sheriff," Eleanor said. Her voice did not rise. "We have nothing left to discuss." "I didn't come to argue with you, Eleanor," Caleb said. He kept his hands at his sides, showing he was not carrying a gun. "And I didn't come to make excuses." "You wrote it in your book," she said. She held the small black notebook in her left hand. Her fingers were tight against the leather. "You said it yourself. You took the shot. You hid the papers." "I did," Caleb said. He looked down at the porch floor. "But you only read the first few pages, the ones written when I was blind with the shock of what I had done. Let me come inside, just for 5 minutes. Then, if you want me to leave, I will go." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She did not open the door wide, but she stepped back. He walked into the small room. It smelled of peppermint and cold ash from the hearth. Caleb stood near the table. He did not sit on the bed. He kept his hat in his hands. "It was the spring of 1874, Caleb said. His voice was low and rough like gravel under a boot. "There was still snow on the high trails. Harrison Holt sent for me at 11 at night. He told me there was a man at the mine. He said the man was armed and dangerous. He told me the man was a thief." Eleanor did not move. She stood by the window. "I rode up the hill alone," Caleb said. "Marcus was in Billings to pick up a shipment of law books. I was 26 years old. I had the star, but I didn't know what it meant to carry it. I saw a man by the tunnel. He was running. He had a valise in his hand. I called out 3 times. He turned. He didn't drop his hands." Caleb stopped. He looked at his boots. "I took the shot," Caleb said. The sound was loud in the canyon. It didn't sound like a gun. It sounded like a piece of iron breaking. When I reached him, he was already falling. His eyes were open. He looked at me, Eleanor. He wasn't angry. He was just surprised, like he couldn't believe what had happened." Eleanor turned her face to the dark glass of the window. "He dropped the valise," Caleb said. "The papers fell out into the dirt. I picked them up. I looked at the name on the front page. It was Daniel Vance. Then he spoke. He didn't ask for a doctor. He just said your name. He said, 'Eleanor.'" Eleanor's shoulders rose and fell. A tear ran down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. "Holt came up the ridge 5 minutes later," Caleb continued. "He told me that I had done my duty. He said he would handle the report. I was young, and I was terrified that the town would find out I had killed an innocent man. So I let him write it. I took the pages from the file because I didn't want the territorial judge to see my name on the report. I was a coward." Eleanor turned back to him. Her eyes were red, but the coldness was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, steady grief. "Why didn't you come to me?" she asked. "Why did you let me travel 2,000 miles to find a grave?" "Because I couldn't look at you," Caleb said. He looked into her eyes. "Because every time I saw the town growing and every time I saw the people living their lives, I felt like a dead man. I stayed here to punish myself. I worked 16 hours a day so I wouldn't have to dream." He took a step toward the table. "Then you came," Caleb said. "And you didn't run. You asked the right questions. You looked at the records. You taught me that a mistake is not the end of the world if a man is willing to stand in the light. A strong educational principle applies here. We must understand that the courage to speak the truth does not exist to win forgiveness from others. It exists out of respect for another human being's right to the facts. Forgiveness is a choice that belongs only to the person who is hurt. It is not something that can be demanded or expected." Eleanor placed the small notebook on the table. She smoothed the cover with her thumb. "You are not a brave man, Caleb," she said. Her voice was rhythmic and clear, like the ticking of the depot clock. "But you are an honest man today." "I am," Caleb said. "Tomorrow we go to the cabin," Eleanor said. "We find the ledger. We find what Daniel died for." Caleb nodded once. He put his hat back on. "Get some rest, Eleanor," he said. He turned and walked out the door, leaving her alone with the notebook and the lamp. The morning fog hung heavy over the creek bed. A light frost coated the wild grass. It was 6 in the morning. Caleb Hayes sat on his horse, waiting near the south end of the depot. He wore his heavy canvas coat and carried his Winchester in the saddle boot. His face was set. He had not slept, but his mind was clear. Eleanor rode out from the boarding house a few minutes later. She rode a small chestnut mare that belonged to the livery stable. She sat straight in the saddle, wearing a heavy winter shawl and leather gloves. "The wind is from the north," she said as she reached his side. "It will snow by noon," Caleb said. "We have to be quick." They rode together without speaking. They took the trail along the east ridge above the Silver Creek Valley. Below them, the town was just waking up. A few chimneys were smoking. A dog barked at the far end of the street. They reached the disputed land at 7:30. The small, half-built cabin stood near the water. The wood was gray and weathered from 4 years of wind and snow. "Sam Okafor's already on the ridge," Caleb said, pointing to a small group of trees on the upper rise. "He and the deputies are watching the road from Holt's place." "Good," Eleanor said. They dismounted and tied the horses to a young birch tree. The cabin floor was covered in dust and dry leaves. The floorboards were old and creaky. Eleanor walked into the center of the room. She pointed to a section of the floor near the north wall. "The nails are different," she said. Caleb walked over. He knelt down. He took a heavy iron knife from his saddlebag and placed it under the edge of the board. He pushed down. The wood groaned. With a sharp crack, the rusted nails pulled out of the joist. Caleb lifted the board. Beneath the floor was a small, square hole dug into the dry earth. Inside was a heavy iron box. It was sealed with heavy wax and wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp out. "This is it," Eleanor whispered. Caleb lifted the box from the hole. He set it on the rough table. Eleanor used her knife to cut the wax. The lid opened with a long, rusty screech. Inside were a number of papers. Some were letters. Some were bank drafts written on the First National Bank of Billings. At the bottom of the box was a large leather-bound ledger. Eleanor opened the ledger. On the first page, written in Daniel's neat script, were the names of the citizens of Silver Creek. Next to the names were the numbers and the interest rates that Holt had charged them. The rates were 40% higher than the rates on file at the land office. "He recorded everything," Eleanor said. Her voice was thick with emotion. She turned the pages. "The loans were paid in full 2 months before he died. Holt knew that if these papers reached the territorial court, he would lose the land." Caleb looked at the papers. He felt a weight lift from his chest. "This is the proof," Caleb said. "This is what he died for." A strong educational principle applies here. We must remember that true community strength does not come from famous leaders or grand actions. It is built by ordinary, silent people who choose to do the right thing even when it costs them dearly. These quiet acts of courage are what hold a society together. Suddenly, a horse whinnied outside. Heavy footsteps sounded on the wooden porch of the cabin. The door swung open. Harrison Holt stood in the frame. He wore a fine black broadcloth coat and carried an ivory-handled Colt revolver in his right hand. 2 men stood behind him, each holding a repeating rifle. "That box doesn't belong to you, Mrs. Vance," Holt said. He smiled, a small, polite smile that did not reach his eyes. Caleb stepped in front of Eleanor. He put his hand on his gun. "Put the iron away, Harrison," Caleb said. His voice was steady and hard, like iron. "You are under arrest." Holt laughed. The sound was thin and hollow in the small room. "Arrest? By what authority, Sheriff?" The town council works for me. The judge in Billings is my guest at the hotel this afternoon. You don't have a badge that means anything here." "The badge means the law," Caleb said. He drew his Colt. The movement was fast, rhythmic, and clear. Before Holt could raise his revolver, the doorway filled with men. Marcus Reed stepped onto the porch with a shotgun in his hands. 2 deputies stood behind him, their rifles leveled at the men behind Holt. "Drop it, gentlemen," Marcus said. His voice was calm and smooth. "The road to the north is closed." Holt looked from Marcus to Caleb. He saw the cold gray in Caleb's eyes. He saw the papers on the table. His hand began to tremble. He let the revolver fall to the dusty floorboards. "You're a fool, Hayes," Holt said. "You'll lose everything for this." "I have already lost everything, Harrison," Caleb said. He stepped forward and snapped the iron cuffs on Holt's wrists. "But today, we start over." Marcus stepped into the cabin. He looked at the ledger on the table. "We'll take this to the Billings coach," Marcus said. He looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am, you have the thanks of 20 families in this valley." Eleanor nodded. She looked at Caleb. The wind began to blow harder against the cabin walls. The first flakes of snow hit the glass of the window. Caleb picked up the box. He turned to Eleanor. "We should go back," he said. "The storm is coming." They walked out of the cabin together. The snow was falling on the hills, white and clean. It is important to understand that truth and justice are the true defenders of human dignity. When ordinary people stand together against greed and deception, they restore the rights and the value of every person in the community. The snow fell thick and steady over Silver Creek. It was the middle of December 1878. The cold had settled into the wood and the stone of the town, frosting the window panes and turning the dirt roads into a quiet sheet of white. But inside the buildings, there was a new kind of warmth. People were no longer whispering in the corners of the saloon. They were speaking openly in the general store and on the boardwalk. 2 months had passed since Harrison Holt was taken away by the federal marshals. The trials in Billings were moving along with clear results. The ledger that Daniel Vance had hidden beneath the floorboards had done exactly what he hoped it would do. It told the truth about the loans and the stolen land. 22 families were getting their deeds back. The town council was being reorganized with honest men who cared about the community. People were looking each other in the eye again without the heavy weight of debt hanging over them. Eleanor Vance stood by the window of the schoolhouse. She watched the children playing in the fresh snow. Their laughter rose through the glass. It was a good sound. It was the sound of a community that was starting to heal after a long, dark period. She had purchased a ticket for the train back east twice, and twice she had walked to the station, looked at the rails stretching across the white prairie, and turned back. The school board had asked her to stay on as the permanent teacher. She had agreed to take the post for the spring term. It is important to understand that healing does not mean the past disappears or that pain is erased. Healing means you learn to live with consciousness. You accept what has happened, and you choose to take responsibility for the future. The community of Silver Creek was learning this lesson. They were finding that a town is only as strong as its ability to be honest with itself and its people. Eleanor turned back to the room. The smell of the cedarwood stove was comforting. She felt a deep sense of purpose here. Daniel would have liked this place. He would have liked the children learning their numbers and reading their books. He would have wanted the community to be fair and honest. The heavy wooden door opened with a slow creak. Caleb Hayes stepped inside. He shook the fresh snow from his dark hat. His dark hair had more silver in it now, but his shoulders were not as tense as they had been 2 months ago. He looked like a man who was no longer running from his shadow. "Sheriff," Eleanor said with a quiet, genuine smile. "Eleanor," Caleb replied. He walked over to the stove and held his large hands near the iron to warm them. "The Billings stage is late today. The pass is blocked with ice from the storm." "It is winter in Montana," she said, leaning against the edge of a student bench. "The snow always has the final say in the mountains." They stood in silence for a moment. It was not the uncomfortable silence of the first days she had arrived. It was the easy, shared quiet of two people who understood each other's history and each other's pain. Caleb looked at the children playing through the window. The blacksmith's boy, Tommy, is doing better with his reading. He showed me his workbook this morning before I started my rounds. He has a good mind, Eleanor said. He just needs someone to show him that the numbers mean something real in his life. Like Daniel used to think, Caleb said. The name came easily now. It did not carry the same sting it once did. It was just a part of the history they shared, a bridge they had crossed together. Yes, Eleanor said softly. She walked toward the front of the room and adjusted a stack of papers. Like Daniel. Caleb looked at her directly. He unbuttoned his canvas coat. I was out at the cabin this morning. The cedar roof held against the storm. The snow didn't find any cracks in the wood. I hired the carpenter to finish the chimney, Eleanor said. We can use it for the reading group in the afternoon when the main room gets too cold. Caleb looked at her for a long time. You are staying, then, through the winter and into the spring. I am staying, Eleanor said. She did not look away. There is still work to do here. The children need a teacher who understands them, and the families who got their land back need to know that the school will stay open. And the sheriff needs someone to remind him to eat before the sun goes down, Caleb added with a small, rare smile that reached his eyes. Eleanor Vance looked at him. The man before her was not the perfect hero from a storybook. He was a man who had made a mistake, a man who had been afraid of his own shadow. But he was also a man who had chosen to stand in the truth. He had owned his past. It is vital to understand that mature love is not about finding a flawless person. Mature love is about choosing to see the flaws in the history of another human being, accepting their past, and deciding to walk beside them anyway. Love is not a sudden magic. It is a long, slow act of trust and understanding that requires patience and honesty. I can teach the sheriff how to cook, Eleanor said, walking toward him. But he must promise to keep the firewood stocked so the schoolhouse stays warm. It is a deal, Caleb said. He walked to the door, put his hat on, and turned. I will see you at Mrs. Calloway's for dinner. Do not let the cold stew sit too long on the back of the stove. I won't, Eleanor said. The door closed behind him with a dull thud. The sound of his boots on the boardwalk was steady and even. He no longer dragged his feet when he walked. He carried the badge with a new kind of purpose. The afternoon sun broke through the gray clouds. It cast a sharp, cold light across the white valley, turning the snow to gold. Eleanor walked out of the schoolhouse at 4 o'clock. The children ran down the road, throwing snowballs and laughing with high voices. She walked past the sheriff's office and down the path toward the west side of the creek. The disputed land belonged to the town now. It was being held in trust for the families who had lost their deeds. The small cabin was finished. The cedar roof was solid, and the smoke rose from the stone chimney. Caleb was there. He was mending the rail of the horse corral that had broken during the autumn wind. He wore his heavy canvas jacket and worked with a rhythmic, steady hand. He drove the iron nails into the cedar posts with a clear, metallic sound that carried across the quiet land. Eleanor stood near the wooden fence. She watched him work. She did not speak immediately. She waited until he had finished the section. Caleb wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his large glove. He looked up and saw her standing there in the cold, clear light of the late afternoon. You're done early at the schoolhouse, Caleb said, setting his hammer on the top rail. The children were too restless with the snow, Eleanor said. They wanted to go home before the sun set. Caleb walked over to the fence. He rested his hands on the top rail. He looked down at the ground between them. I was thinking about what we do with this cabin in the spring, Caleb said. What do you think we should do? She asked, leaning against the fence post. We could turn it into the town library, Caleb said. We have the books coming from Billings next month, and the children need more than just the chalkboards. They need a place to read about the world beyond Montana. Eleanor smiled. It was a broad, open smile that made the cold air seem lighter. That is a very good idea, Daniel would have liked that. He believed that books belong to everyone, not just those who can afford to buy them. Then we will do it, Caleb said. He looked at her for a long moment. There was no need to hide from the past anymore. They had faced it. They had found the ledger, and they had seen what Holt had done. The truth was out in the open, and the town was moving forward. Eleanor, Caleb said. His voice dropped. It became very quiet. I know that things are not easy between us. I know that time is what we need to heal. We have the winter, Eleanor said. She stepped closer to the fence. And the spring is not too far away. He reached out and took her gloved hand. The leather was warm. It was real. There was no hesitation in his touch. It is important to understand that human life is not defined by the mistakes we make. It is defined by how we choose to move forward once we know the truth. We must respect the dignity of every individual, learn from the past, and make sure that justice and compassion guide our future. They stood by the fence in the cold Montana air. The town of Silver Creek was quiet. The train in the distance blew its whistle. It was a sharp, clear sound that carried over the white hills. It was not a sound of danger or uncertainty. It was the sound of a new arrival, of connection and of growth. Caleb squeezed her hand. Every calm after, Caleb said softly, brings the cowboy back. Eleanor looked at him. Her eyes were bright and clear. Let's go inside, she said. The fire is lit. They turned and walked toward the cabin door. The snow crunched under their boots. They were not running from the past anymore. They were walking into the future, together. That is how life begins again. Not with a rush, but with a simple, steady step. It is the way the land heals. It is the way people heal, one day, one moment, and one truth at a time. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
As the snow settled over Silver Creek, it did not erase the past, but it softened the road ahead. Caleb Hayes could never undo the shot he fired, and Eleanor Vance could never bring Daniel back from the grave. Yet their story reminds us that healing does not begin when pain disappears. Healing begins when the truth is finally spoken, when guilt stops hiding in the shadows, and when wounded people find the courage to face one another with honesty. Caleb was not a flawless hero. He was a man who made a terrible mistake, a man who allowed fear and shame to silence him for too many years. But in the end, he chose to stand in the light. He chose to confess, to seek justice, and to protect the very truth he once tried to bury. Eleanor's journey teaches us another powerful lesson. She came to Silver Creek as a grieving widow, searching for answers, not sympathy. She reminds us that love is not only tenderness. Sometimes love is courage. Sometimes love is crossing 2,000 miles, opening old records, asking painful questions, and refusing to let a good person's name be forgotten. Through her strength, Daniel's sacrifice was honored. A corrupt man was exposed, and an entire town was given back its dignity. This story also tells us that justice is never only about punishment. True justice restores what greed has stolen. It gives the weak a voice, returns dignity to families, and allows a community to look itself in the eye again. Silver Creek was not saved by one perfect cowboy, or one fearless woman alone. It was saved because ordinary people finally chose truth over comfort, courage over silence, and compassion over judgment. And perhaps the deepest meaning of this tale is that a human life should never be measured only by its worst mistake. We are shaped by what we do after the truth is known. Caleb could have continued hiding. Eleanor could have chosen only bitterness. But instead, both of them walked toward something higher: accountability, forgiveness, and a future built on honesty. Their bond was not born from forgetting the past, but from facing it together. So let this story stay with us as a quiet reminder. Do not judge too quickly. Do not hide from the truth. And do not underestimate the power of compassion. In every wounded heart, there may still be a path back to goodness. In every broken town, there may still be a chance to rebuild. And after every storm, if we are brave enough to seek the truth, there can still come a calm.